Andres, we talk about why we are here today, and we want to understand from your perspectives, why do Hispanic need a special lens or special attention, and what are their peculiar problems and why?
Sure. So first of all, we historians tend to be long-winded, and I have heard that here you want it fast and furious, so I want to distill it in two-liners. So first of all, in keeping in context the data-driven emphasis that I love, I want to say that, of course, this is not a minority history. It will become a majority history by the middle of the century, so that's a given. Second of all, most of us here with a Hispanic Latino background would find it less readily to identify with a narrative that goes from east to west. Rather, we want to go with a narrative that goes from south to north or something to that, to simplify. And diversity is good. So all of that is very clear. But also, and that's the part that I wanted to give a soundbite, and in following with what you were saying, 16th century exploration voyages were incredible because they really provided great scientific and geographic knowledge. And this is something that we don't necessarily know about it, just the challenge of navigating huge oceans, the challenge of understanding currents and winds. All of that required incredible breakthroughs that are central to the history of Latinos and Hispanics. So thank you.
Amazing. Now, David, why this panel today, and what are the issues you see?
So I think, as you've been seeing just with the conference, diversity is really built into the DNA of Hispanic identity. But what do we mean when we talk about diversity? And I think that's an important contribution that the Latino Hispanic community can make. I think it's come up when we talk about unity in diversity. Diversity for its own sake, well, that may not really lead to anything, but a kind of interculturality is something that I think is really indicative of the Hispanic experience and a kind of hybrid identity, to use the language of mestizaje. I don't know if you're familiar with that term, but when you think of Nuestra Señora de Guadalupe, these symbols, these very important symbols of Hispanic identity, they really represent the coming together of peoples, races, and ethnicities. And the challenges that come with that coming together, sometimes forced, but hopefully not through a method of nonviolence. So I think that's really, when we think about the symbols that inform Hispanic identity, someone like Our Lady of Guadalupe and the mestizaje that's there. Simón Bolívar also had an idea of thinking about the Latin American identity as being distinct. Again, a kind of unity and diversity. Not like Europe, kind of focused on ethnic kind of homogeny, but rather a diverse experience that's still united together by a common project. Among indigenous peoples today, the language of Abya Yala is used to talk about the land or the continent that's full of life and flourishing. This is another way that we can think about unity and diversity in Latin America in particular, but also here in the United States. So I think that the symbolic importance of Latino identity is crucial. And the last thing I'll say is also the work that I do particularly is looking at, I think if we're going to really think about Hispanic identity for the future, we have to think about the intellectual contributions of Hispanic people, because so often in our racialized culture today, there's ways of looking down on Hispanic identity from an intellectual standpoint. And I know this being an academic, when I had a classmate of mine told that Spanish wasn't a real modern language because there wasn't much scholarship coming out of Spanish-speaking populations. So that way of thinking has to be reframed. And one of the ways that I would like to do that in my work is to look at what Andres was talking about in the 16th century, the contributions to modern international law, debates about global human rights discourse that came out of the colonization of the Americas, and the debates about the rights of indigenous peoples. There's a bust of Francisco de Vitoria here at the UN, who is a 16th century Spanish Dominican and friar who is kind of seen as a pioneer for international law and the rights of peoples.
Amazing. So now, Richard, is there a distinctively Hispanic history in the U.S.? And if so, can you tell us more about it, please?
As you can probably tell by my name, I'm not Hispanic. Actually, I'm Ukrainian Jewish heritage, so, but that's not neither here nor there. But when you look at this, yes, it gives me some objectivity. But when you think about the history of Jews as a minority, or the history of Native American peoples as minority, viewed from outside, everyone thinks of, oh, they're all Hispanics, they're all Jews, they're all Indians. Well, they're Comanches, and there's Lenapis, and there's Dakotas, and there's Seminoles, and Creeks. And in a sense, it's very easy to lump Hispanics into a single category. But viewed from outside, and as David just said, you see nothing but diversity. Diversity. The differences between the Californianos in California, the Nuevos Ricos Mexicanos in Nueva Mexico, los Tejanos, the Braceros in 20th century California, the Menorcans who showed up thanks to the British in Florida in the end of the 18th century. In a sense, there is a great diversity in Hispanic culture in the United States, and it's that diversity that makes it such a rich and interesting culture, and it has to be understood by the people outside that, essentially, that rata, as David said before this morning, that have to understand how important that diversity is, because in diversity and cooperation, together, there's strength.
How about you, Felipe?
Well, thank you very much, Anna. The honor is all mine, or possibly ours. In fact, I've never felt, sitting here on a bar stool with a hand mic, I've never felt quite so much like a nightclub comedian. My only fear is that I probably won't be quite so funny. Obviously, I agree with my distinguished colleague, Richard. He's a historian of Spain, amongst many other distinguished activities. And of course, you know, unity in diversity is the great theme of Spanish history. And of course, you know, it applies to every community. There's no such thing as a homogeneous community anywhere in the world at any level. And of course, it's also true that all the communities that have contributed to the history of the United States are of equal dignity and importance. We should celebrate them all, and Jewish Americans, and of course, especially Native Americans who've been here for longer than any of the rest of us. But apart from the Native Americans, Hispanics do have a distinctive feature in that they've been here for longer than any of the other newcomers. You know, one of my early experiences was giving a series of lectures at the Air Force Academy in Colorado, and the young lieutenant they gave me, you know, to look after me, told me that he was in favor of immigration. And I thought that was very big of him, since I was an immigrant myself. He was in favor of immigration, but he said, everybody who comes here has to learn the native language. And since I didn't think he was talking about Ute or Comanche, I agreed with him. I said, yes, everybody should be made to learn Spanish. and when he looked puzzled, I did point out that we were in the state of Colorado, and that really rather brought the debate to an end. And I think that's one of the great tasks, is to alert our fellow residents, fellow citizens, for those of you who are citizens of the United States, to the long and imperishable and essential contribution that Hispanics have made to this country, which in terms of the making of the United States from south to north is of at least equal importance as the making of the United States from east to west. The Stars and Stripes has a warp as well as a weft, and that's what Hispanic people have contributed.
Amazing. Eduardo, any other contribution on the Hispanic history of the U.S.?
Hello? Yes. Well, it's going to be a difficult act to follow. Not having this, talking after my friend Felipe Fernandez Armesto, who is so fluent in English. I think it's Oxford English, but anyway, a bit modified by his long stays in the United States.
My old friends will also deny it, I'm sure.
I will try my best. First of all, a point of clarification. I have been hearing during the very interesting, for me it has been moving, the meeting of this morning, both speaking about Hispanos and Latinos. And I want to put a little comment on this. For me, coming from Spain, and remember that Spain is no longer has the monopoly of the Spanish language or the Hispanic culture or any other, as you have very clearly stated. Now the Hispanics in the US are the third or the fourth GDP country in the world. So we don't claim this kind of credit. But I do believe very much in the legacy of Spain in the United States. And when the question was, is there a distinctively Spanish history in the US? There is. However, it depends from where this history comes from, because when we are talking about the Latino and the Hispanic, of course, Latino was a term invented by the French, who were coming much later, but of course they have been much more clever in stating their legacy for the American culture. And this is why, probably because Lafayette, Marquis de Lafayette, is a much better known character than Bernardo de Galvez, the winner of the Mississippi, river, of all the Pacific, the Gulf of Mexico, the strongholds of the Brits, and it would have been impossible for Washington and Lafayette to win the decisive Battle of Yorktown without the situation that Bernardo de Galvez made it possible by totally impeding the British fleet to go into the battle in the northern theater. So I think it's very important when you study American history where it comes from, because we have had great defenders of the Hispanic legacy. Charles Bloom is one of them. Herbert Bolton, David Weber he died recently, and we had the honor of being in the same seminar many times, one of them at the National Portrait Gallery in 2007. And these people were explaining very well, the same way that now Felipe Fernandez Armeso, Richard Kagan, David, and Andres are doing, the important legacy of Spain in the United States. But there have been other sources of information.
Can we switch the
I
mic?
do believe it is important to understand. Thank you. It is important to understand that there was a trend not to recognize the Spanish legacy for many reasons. One of them that when Spain contributed in a very important way to the War of Independence, Spain was still, for being an ally, he became a rival. Yep. Because we commanded all that was today's two-thirds of the American territory west of the Mississippi. On the other hand, it was in the interest of the American pioneers coming to the West to denigrate somehow the Spanish legacy, because it will be easier for them to dominate both the Indians and the Hispanics that were living in that area by trying to prove that they were the descendant of a kind of tyrannic, fanatic, and not very respectable crowd. And in this respect, I would recommend, I talked about David Weber, there is this book, and I'm not doing a free commercial because the poor man is already dead, Foreigners in their native land. The basic of this book is proving that there was a trend into putting down the Hispanic legacy because it was in the interest of the dominant Anglo culture in the world. So, thank you.
Thank you so much. Now, we go back to Richard, and then we are going to start analyzing the perceptions of Hispanics in the US. Historically, we are seen as a minority group that has suffered from persecution, oppression, victimization, and underrepresentation. But we would like to know from you if this is in fact true, and if yes, Can we and should we see it more positively?
Well, there's no, is this working? Is that, oh, está muerto. There's no doubt. Hispanics tended to be Catholics, and this country was really born as a Protestant country, and there was discrimination against Catholics in general, right through to the end of the 19th century, and some would say beyond that. Plus, in the course of the 19th century, there was this development of what we call modern biological racism. And the way it was constructed, at least in North America and in Europe in the 19th century, is that Hispanics were of at a lesser rank than Anglos. So in the sense that discrimination was there. But what we do know is that starting the end of the 19th century, there was a kind of a new interest, a growing interest in what Walt Whitman, the great 19th century poet, called the underground river of Hispanic culture in the United States. He said, we really don't know how important that is until we study it. And it's going to blossom forth, we don't know when, he said. He's writing this in 1883. And he said, we don't know when it's going to come and bubble up to the surface. But when it does, we'll be amazed by what he called the loyalty, the patriotism, the faith, and the strength of the Hispanic people in the Americas. And in a sense, that notion of a sturdy people, a courageous people, is something that kind of hooked onto the American mentality in the course of the 19th century. You can see it, the fact that in the Capitol building, if those of you who've been in Washington, D.C., Hernando de Soto is there. Columbus is there. What other countries have, quote, foreigners as part of their foreign contributions to their history as part of their national history? The United States is quite unique to think that De Soto, Hernando de Soto, who's not the nicest guy in the world, is hanging alongside the Pilgrims or William Penn. So in a sense, there's a current of American history that was beginning to be discovered in the course of the 19th century, first in Florida, of all places, then in California, then in New Mexico. And it blossomed forth. And with that rediscovery of the history came the discovery of Spanish culture, Spanish language, Spanish songs. And those histories, and I should say Hispanic or Spanish revival architecture, those histories need to be studied because they've been underappreciated in the past. And to me, it's always telling that somewhere roughly around 1920, when mission-style architecture in Spanish, which is really Spanish Renaissance or Mexican Renaissance architecture or Baroque architecture, was all the vogue, whether in Florida or in Texas or in California, that style of architecture was supposed to be the national architecture of the United States. Yeah. Because it was autochthonous. It was here, as Felipe said, along with Hispanics, right from the very beginning, and is rediscovered at the end of the 19th century, and many of you may live in what's called Spanish Revival style houses, whether in Baltimore or in San Francisco. It's there, it's around you, and that needs to be studied and appreciated. So there's lots to be discovered anew about Hispanic culture, and it's, once again, to go back to my notion, the diversity of that culture in the history of the United States. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, Felipe, Eduardo, any remarks to add to those?
I think Felipe is, okay, I talk. Well, thank you very much. I think it's very interesting what Richard has said. But, you know, I have seen a crowd of people interested in facts and interested in what is there in America, what is in there for me. And I think, if I may say so, it is important for the Hispanic community to assert the important contribution of the Hispanic culture to this country. Because if you go to, especially the Southwest, and when I was Consul General in Los Angeles, I used to have an adobe house on north of Santa Fe. And there, you know, I was amazed. I was more proud of my Hispanic heritage in New Mexico than I have been ever in Spain, because there they keep some traditions and some customs and some beliefs that have already been lost in Spain. But what I'm saying, what can the Latino Hispanic community win by asserting this Hispanic tradition? A lot. Because I think the perception of a country is done by many things. Some of them are untouchable. They are intangible. So Among them is the history. And I do believe that by feeling proud of this important contribution, you can advance in your own society. When I had the honor of having this seminar with Felipe Fernandez Armesto and Andrés Resendez at the National Portrait Gallery in Washington with the Smithsonian Institution, I just published an article in one of the Spanish newspaper, and it was called Bernardo de Galvez versus Lafayette. And what I tried to explain is that the lack of knowledge of the Hispanic hero, because he has been recently appointed as an honorary citizen of the United States, but much later than Lafayette. And, you know, by this conception of the French legacy against Hispanic, you know, what I discover is a mediocre French wine is worth 2 times more than a real Spanish Rioja wine. So you have to win in this respect. Thank you.
Well, I was hoping that my fellow panelists would leave me no time to say anything more. But unfortunately, apparently they have left me a little time. Of course, yes, oppression, yes, victimization, yes, expropriation, massacre, religious persecution. I fully agree with what Eduardo has said about the importance of the religious heritage that distinguishes the Hispanic tradition in the United States. I'm so glad that we began this meal with a prayer of thanksgiving and an invocation of the Blessed Virgin of Guadalupe, because even those of my fellow Hispanics who have rejected their Catholic tradition can only have done so because there is a Catholic tradition to reject. So, of course, I mean, all of those horrors have befallen Hispanics in the United States. But Anna asks, can we see things more positively? No, because all of those sufferings, all of those sacrifices are extremely positive. It's in the knowledge of those sufferings and sacrifices that we can forge the common identity that so many of my fellow panelists and so many of the speakers this morning were talking about. Native Americans have done it very successfully. Black Americans have done it very successfully. Irish and Italian Americans to a lesser extent. We need to be very aware of the sufferings of our forebears and very frank and candid about them in demanding justice in the future.
Amazing, thank you. Now we have the last question, so I hope that you are enjoying the lunch, but not before talking about dissemination. When we talk about history, we talk about a lot of information that needs to be shared. And then my question for Andres and for David is, do historical memory, like monuments, courses, curricula, textbooks, do they matter? And also, is diversity in entertainment and education still relevant?
Right, well, this is a softie that because we are all here historians, so it would be crazy for me to say that it doesn't matter, because that's what we do on a day in and day out. But let me just briefly answer to you that with the one image that drew me into history, which is, if you don't know your history, you're a little bit like a leaf in the wind. And it is only by understanding how these leaves is attached to branches, and these branches lead to even broader trunks, and you finally get to the big tree of humanity, is that you begin to appreciate where you are. And just as you appreciate who you are, we are also at the time of reckoning, racial, all kinds of reckoning. And I think history is one way, and I wholeheartedly agree with what Felipe is saying, that in this era of reckoning, I think we need to embrace both the good, the inventive, the innovative parts of it, and we need to recognize what our culture, because we are not responsible for that directly at this generation, but we need to recognize where we come from and what happened in the past.
Yep.
So, thank you.
Awesome.
Yeah, building on that theme of reckoning and looking at stories of struggle and justice from the past, I think it's important. Even in academia, we're contending with a canceling of history, an attempt to try to just ignore the past or just pretend like it didn't happen because of atrocities that took place. I teach a course entitled God and Slavery in the Americas, and this is my small way of trying to get students not to just think about how it is that in these periods of for example, conquest, both in Latin America but also in North America with the English in particular, there were stories, amazing stories of indigenous people's agency, but also Europeans who were allies to them. And so raising those stories up, I think, are extremely important for this kind of reckoning to take place. But all of this, at least for me in my class, is not just so that we look at the past for its own sake, but to see how these things continue in the present day. And I think that's part of the kind of naivete of the kind of canceling of the past that sometimes goes on in our culture, is the belief, the looking back on history from a kind of anachronistic point of view, that, well, we're different today. We don't do those things. Yeah, right. Injustices continue. And so, one of the groups that I look at in particular in my work, I was just talking about, the importance of, obviously, the struggle of farm workers, agricultural laborers, migrants in our nation's history. Cesar Chavez was referred to earlier. The United Farm Workers. There's another amazing group called the Coalition of Immokalee Workers. I'm from Florida, and I heard about them growing up in Florida. That has been able to lead to incredible changes in the consumer industry. At the highest level, Walmart, Taco Bell, Trader Joe's, these are organizations that have kind of allowed themselves to listen to these organizations, or this particular coalition, in order to grant the justice that's due, the fair wages that are due to these workers, and in order to affect change in these communities.
Perfect. Well,
yeah, I think,
okay, yeah, go ahead.
Yes. Now, putting a footnote in what he just said, I think it is very important to recognize what was positive in the legacy of Spain to the United States. And we have, as they have mentioned here before, many points of interest, but I would concentrate in the Southwest, because there, you have to recognize so much the importance of agriculture, the importance of architecture, the irrigation, and of course, the taming of the horses and all that. It's all Spanish. You call it rodeo. Rodeo, nobody knows what is. Rodeo is a Spanish name. Lasso is a Spanish name. Reata is a Spanish name. Adobe. So I think it's important to value what this contribution was. And I do believe it is wrong to judge in a very strong terms. For example, Juan de Oñate. Juan de Oñate, who has been criticized, and talking about monuments, his statue demolished in the Camino Real. One cannot forget that he was 20 years before the Pilgrims. He did the first ceremony of Acción de Gracias, in the marches of the Rio Grande, 20 years before the Pilgrims. So I hope that if we keep, as I hope, this meeting in the succeeding year, I hope we can change the Thanksgiving Day to the one that did Juan de Oñate in the border of the Rio Grande. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Eduardo. And yes, please, I want to say as well, even though I'm not part of the panel, that one of the things that personally moves me the most is to see the role models, not only in monuments, in books, because yes, it was a tricky question. We wanted to hear directly from you why these resources matter. But then I also want us to go also deep in the entertainment industry. You all know that Lin-Manuel Miranda has done great things at bringing the Hispanic culture out there. And then we need to have more channels of dissemination like that. And we need all of you to start thinking into how can we make this bigger and known. And again, this panel is just the beginning to plant that seed and then hopefully make our history known so we can shape our future better. So now to close off, I just want to ask our star panelists to leave the stage with like 30 seconds, one last message that you want to share with the audience.
Well, before I answer that, Anna, let me just mention one thing that I don't think has had enough salience in the event so far, and that's the language. You know, if there is one bond that we have that can help to forge that common Hispanic sense of belonging to each other, it is the language. I find it very embarrassing that at the Hispanic Leadership Summit, all the proceedings have been in this terrible foreign language that we've been using. Así que apostamos por Dios, apostamos por el uso del idioma. And my nomination, you know, for my favorite Hispanic character is a fictional one. It's Zorro.
El Zorro.
Because, you know, in this country, in order to understand Americans, you've got to understand their heroes. And to understand their heroes, you've got to understand their superheroes. And you've got to understand why all of those superheroes are masked. And why, well, except for Superman, who does the reverse. He takes his glasses off. I've tried it many times. It doesn't work. And of course, the reason for that is that they are all based on Zorro, who is a Hispanic hero who fought for the Californios against the Yankees. And I find it deeply ironical and very suggestive of the role, the absolutely vital role of the Hispanic tradition in the forging of American culture, that Americans base their common superhero on a Hispanic original.
Thank you. 30 seconds. One last message.
Well, I want to bring to life a real hero. El Leoncito. Who's heard of El Leoncito? And he's from New Mexico here. Born Mexican. Fought against the Yankees in the Mexican-American War of 1845 or 6. Went to Arizona. Fought for the Union against the Confederacy. Won a battle against the Confederate forces when the Confederates were trying to take Arizona and New Mexico. Was elected to the territorial governance of New Mexico. Fought, probably the first person to fought for bilingual education in the United States. Long lived, this was the son, excuse me, this is the son of Manuel Amado Chavez. Fought for bilingual education in the United States. No one had done that before. Was subsequently elected Ministry of Health or something like that, became mayor of Santa Fe. And as mayor of Santa Fe, he re-Hispanized. Those of you who weren't in Santa Fe in 1880 didn't know that it looked like a New England town. They had gotten rid of the adobe. They put little kind of gingerbread on top of the Casa del Corregidor. And it was all taken off in the first part of the 20th century when they changed the names of the streets from English names to Spanish names. They wanted to make it a kind of Hispanic city or a Latino city, and made it, in a sense, give it a kind of a touristic lure that the old New England and Santa Fe lacked. And Amado Chavez is part of that record. And we know virtually nothing about him except for one book written about 50 years ago by a man named Merle Simmons, who died even before David Weber.
Is that so?
Yes.
He was a close friend of mine. Well, if I may mention another person who was very important and not recognized, I think it works, no? It is Pedro Ortiz y Pino. He was, in 1812, the deputy of New Mexico to the Cortes de Cádiz. Spain was then invaded by Napoleon, and the only stronghold was Cádiz. And these people, crazy Spaniards, they decided that surrounded by the Napoleonic troops and having the bombs falling all the time in this little city, they decided what? To create a new constitution, the first liberal constitution, la Constitución de Cádiz, that then influenced all the rest of the European constitution. This guy, who was called Pedro Ortiz y Pino, descended from New Mexico, had to do all the way to Veracruz and then go and go to Cádiz. So eventually he arrived where the constitution was already done and written. But to inform the constitution and the people what happened in this remote, they were not colony, they were called provincias. It was still a province of Spain in the north of Mexico. He did this thing called Exposición Sucinta y Sencilla de Nuevo Mexico. And this has been considered by some of the modern American writers probably the best testimony of what was this kind of very remote and far and poor, surrounded by 33 tribes of Indian so that it was very important. So I think it is important to recognize these people, and once during the quincentenary, they named me like ambassador to this area in order to promote this kind of the Spanish legacy. And at one point at the Rancho de las Golondrinas, that some of them might know, it was the place for the old conducta that came, it came from Santa Fe all the way down to Mexico. Well, there was this lady who was
sorry, Eduardo, we run out of time.
One second. Doña Concha Ortiz y Pino, she had been the Speaker of the Assembly, and she recognized me. She was this not very tall guy with a strong pinion, typical Jewish features, and she said, "Oh, Ambassador, I am really glad. I want to welcome you, especially since we have been waiting for you for the last 300 years. Thank you very much."
Thank you. And then to close, Andres,
super brief again. Everybody's talking about their favorite forgotten Hispanic figure. Mine is not even about the hemisphere, it's about the world. So today we're living in an Asia-Pacific world, and Hispanics were at the very beginning of that world. So last year I published a book about the very first expedition that went from the Americas to Asia and back, and that paved the way for the so-called Manila Galleon that transformed the world, and in some ways it's the beginning of the world as we know it today, because high production crops like corn, for example, transformed China, and in its turn, China transformed the Americas. So just, I will leave you with that. The Hispanic production and contribution to the world is not just about the hemisphere, it's about the entire world.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And David?
So, well, being a scholar of a figure of Bartolomé de las Casas, I must mention him just to say, here you have an amazing example of a European who encountered the indigenous peoples as a bishop, but also a legal advocate whose legacy has continued throughout Latin America. But I'm going to also mention someone else who you've never heard of and you probably never will hear of, and that's Lupe Gonzalo. And just talking about farm workers earlier, I mean, she's a farm worker down in Florida who's experienced very severe situations of abuse and injustice, and yet has turned that into a vehicle for empowering others to speak out and to seek justice. And I think that just the last note that I'd want to end with came out in the last panel from earlier. I think it was Maria Cuba who said, success is collective, or we have to think about success collectively. And I think we have to think about the same when it comes to justice. We can't think about justice as our individual plight alone, but rather as a collective endeavor. And so if we use the language of rights, for example, to defend what we believe is important to us and for others, we have to also think about the duties and the responsibilities that are associated with that. So I'll just end on that note.
Thank you very much. Now, can we please have a round of applause for this stellar panel that we have here with us today? Thank you so much for your time.